Before there was a roar, there was silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a world still becoming. A planet mid-construction, wrapped in ocean so vast and so alien that nothing you have ever imagined about prehistoric life could prepare you for it. There were no continents as you would recognize them. No mountains cutting familiar silhouettes against a sky. No forests, no soil thick with roots. No shorelines crowded with anything that breathed air with intention. There was only water. Warm, mineral-dense, and older than almost everything that would come after it. And inside that water, long before the first footprint was ever pressed into mud, something was already hunting. We have a habit, as a species, of organizing the past around the creatures we find most dramatic. We build museums around them. We name eras after their dominance. For most people, when the mind reaches back into deep time, it reaches toward the same images. A Tyrannosaurus moving through ferned lowlands, a Brachiosaurus pulling leaves from a canopy too tall for anything else, pterosaurs banking against a Jurassic sky. These are the rulers of our imagination. These are the monarchs of the prehistoric world we were taught to remember. But here is the problem with that story. It begins far too late. By the time the first dinosaur drew breath, approximately 230 to 240 million years ago, sharks had already been in the oceans for nearly twice as long. Some estimates push their origin further still. The oldest confirmed shark scales discovered in the fossil record date to roughly 450 million years ago, placing their emergence deep within the Ordovician period, in an ocean so different from today's that its chemistry, its temperature, its very color would be unrecognizable to modern eyes. Dinosaurs were newcomers. Sharks were already ancient. To fully grasp what this means, you have to let go of the timeline you were given. Dinosaurs lived for approximately 165 million years before the mass extinction event that ended their reign. That number feels incomprehensible. And yet sharks had already been refining their design, dominating ocean ecosystems, and surviving planetary catastrophe for hundreds of millions of years before a single dinosaur ever existed. The comparison doesn't diminish the dinosaurs. It simply places them where they belong, inside a story that had already been running, quietly and relentlessly, beneath the surface of every sea on Earth. The period that concerns us most begins around 419 million years ago. Geologists call it the Devonian. Historians of life on Earth call it something else, the Age of Fishes. And that name, while accurate, understates what was actually happening. The Devonian was not simply an era of abundant fish. It was the crucible in which vertebrate life found its direction. It was the period when the ocean stopped being a place of soft-bodied drifters and filter feeders and became something with edges. Something with teeth. The oceans of the Devonian were competitive in a way they had never been before, layered with predator and prey in a hierarchy that would shape the blueprint of marine ecosystems for hundreds of millions of years to come. But they weren't the sharks, you know. The early sharks of the Devonian bear little surface resemblance to the sleek, cartilaginous hunters that patrol modern waters. They were experiments, biological drafts, some with fins in unexpected configurations, some with teeth unlike anything that survives today. Cladoselache, one of the earliest sharks with reasonably complete fossil evidence, was already a predator of significant design, with a streamlined body, a deeply forked tail built for speed, and jaws that suggest an animal refined by millions of years of selection pressure. It was not primitive in any dismissive sense. It was precisely engineered for its environment. The ocean, it seems, found the shark shape early and kept returning to it. Surrounding these early sharks were creatures that deserved their own moment of recognition. The Devonian seas were dominated in part by armored fish, a group called placoderms, that represented the apex of evolution in their time. Some of them were enormous. Dunkleosteus, the most famous of the placoderms, reached lengths estimated between 6 and 10 meters, with a skull built from articulated bone plates and a bite that rivaled anything the Mesozoic would later produce. These were not passive animals. They were apex predators of extraordinary power, and they shared the Devonian Ocean with the early sharks that would eventually outlast them. When the Devonian ended in one of the 5 great mass extinctions in Earth's history, the placoderms were gone. The sharks were not. This is the detail that begins to shift everything. Surviving one mass extinction could be circumstance. Surviving multiple extinction events, the late Devonian, the Permian Triassic extinction that erased nearly 96% of all marine species, the Triassic-Jurassic boundary event, and eventually the same catastrophe that ended the dinosaurs, requires something more than luck. It requires a fundamental correctness of design. It requires an organism that has solved, at some deep biological level, the problem of persistence. Sharks did not survive the history of this planet by accident. They survived it because the ocean, in all its changing forms, continued to need what they were. And that raises a question that quietly unsettles the entire narrative of prehistoric dominance. We have spent generations defining Earth's past through the lens of the creatures that walked on land. We measured greatness in size and spectacle in the drama of extinction. But beneath every chapter of that story, in every ocean that surrounded every continent through every age of life on Earth, sharks were present. Hunting, adapting, enduring. While empires rose on land and collapsed into fossil beds, the sea kept its own record, a longer record, a quieter one. To understand how sharks achieved this, we must go deeper into their biology than most histories allow. We must enter a world built not from bone, but from something far older and far stranger. The ocean 400 million years ago was not a place of blue clarity and filtered sunlight. It was turbid, layered, and dense with biological competition, at a scale that is difficult to comprehend from the vantage point of the modern world. The Devonian seas teemed with life forms that have since vanished so completely that they leave behind only fragmentary impressions in stone. Scales, fragments of jaw, the ghost outlines of creatures that dominated entire ecosystems and then disappeared without any descendant to carry their memory forward. To understand the sharks that lived among them, you first have to understand the world those sharks inhabited. Not as background, but as pressure, because it was precisely that pressure, relentless, escalating, and ultimately catastrophic, that forged the traits that would define the shark lineage for hundreds of millions of years to come. The Devonian Ocean was stratified by dominance in a way that modern seas only partially replicate. At the surface and in the mid-water column, schools of jawless fish and early bony fish moved in currents that carried nutrients upwelled from the deep. Closer to the seafloor, in the shallows around ancient reef structures, built not by coral as we know it, but by stromatoporoids and tabulate corals, a different kind of drama was unfolding. This was where the armored fish ruled, the placoderms, and among all the placoderms that ever lived, One genus has earned a particular kind of notoriety, not because it is the most studied, but because the fossil record, in rare moments of completeness, allowed scientists to look directly into what it was capable of. Dunkleosteus torelli was not a fish in any sense that feels familiar. It was a machine of consumption. Estimates of its total body length range between 6 and 10 meters depending on the specimen and the methodology used to extrapolate from the preserved bony head plates. But it is those head plates that tell the most important story. Dunkleosteus did not have teeth in the conventional sense. It had self-sharpening blades of bone, formed from the edges of its fused cranial armor, that functioned with a mechanical efficiency that no modern jaw can quite match. Biomechanical studies of its skull have suggested a bite force exceeding 5,000 newtons, with a jaw opening cycle so rapid that it generated significant suction, drawing prey inward before the strike was even complete. It could consume almost anything that shared its ocean, and for a significant portion of the Devonian, it did. What Dunkleosteus represented was the apex of one evolutionary philosophy, the philosophy of armor. The placoderms had answered the problem of survival in a competitive ocean by becoming fortresses. Their anterior bodies were encased in articulated bone plates, thick enough to resist the attacks of most contemporaries, jointed in ways that allowed the head to tilt upward during feeding, amplifying the mechanical advantage of the jaw. This was sophisticated engineering. It was also extraordinarily costly. Bone is metabolically expensive to produce and maintain. Armored animals, by the nature of their design, carry their protection with them at all times, regardless of whether the threat is present. They are built for the worst-case scenario, even during periods of relative calm. The early sharks operating in the same ecosystems had chosen a different answer entirely. It was not a lesser answer. It was a more elegant one, and its elegance was rooted in a material that, at first consideration, sounds like a biological compromise: cartilage. Shark skeletons contain no true bone. They are built entirely from cartilage, the same flexible, semi-rigid connective tissue that gives the human ear and nose their shape. In the context of vertebrate evolution, this has sometimes been interpreted as a primitive condition, as though sharks simply never got around to developing the harder internal framework that most vertebrates eventually adopted. That interpretation is almost certainly wrong. Cartilage in sharks is not an absence of development. It is a specific and highly refined solution to a specific set of biological problems. The evidence for this becomes clear the moment you examine what cartilage actually allows. A cartilaginous skeleton is significantly lighter than a bony one of equivalent structural support. For an animal that lives its entire life in three-dimensional space, never resting on a solid surface, buoyancy is not a minor convenience. It is a fundamental operating condition. Bony fish compensate for the weight of their skeletons with swim bladders, gas-filled chambers that require active metabolic management and impose constraints on how quickly the animal can change depth. Sharks have no swim bladder. Their lighter skeletons, combined with large livers saturated with low-density oils, provide passive buoyancy that requires no physiological maintenance. The energy that a bony fish spends managing its swim bladder, a shark redirects entirely toward locomotion and predation. Cartilage also bends without fracturing under stress. A skeleton built to flex rather than resist allows a shark's body to function as a continuous mechanical system during pursuit, with forces transmitted and distributed across the entire structure rather than concentrated at rigid joints. Cladoselache, one of the best documented early sharks of the late Devonian, displayed a body plan that reflects this principle with remarkable clarity. Its deeply forked symmetrical tail, a shape associated in modern hydrodynamics with high-speed, energy-efficient swimming, suggests an animal that had already solved the basic problem of aquatic propulsion more than 370 million years ago. Its pectoral fins were broad and triangular, likely providing lift and precise directional control during pursuit. There were no scales of the rough dermal denticle type that later sharks would develop, but the underlying architecture was already pointing in the direction that the lineage would continue to refine across geological epochs. The contrast between Cladoselache and Dunkleosteus was not simply a contrast of body plans. It was a contrast of evolutionary strategies being tested simultaneously in the same environment, under the same conditions, with outcomes that neither could anticipate. Dunkleosteus offered brute force and biological fortification. Cladoselache offered speed, flexibility, and low metabolic overhead. In the thriving, resource-rich waters of the Devonian's peak, both strategies were viable. Competition was intense but manageable. The reefs provided enough structural complexity to support layered predation. The seas were warm and productive. For a time, the arms race between different predatory philosophies was effectively a draw. Then the Devonian ended. It did not end quickly, and it did not end cleanly. The late Devonian extinction was not a single event, but a prolonged crisis. A series of ecological pulses spread across perhaps 20 million years that systematically dismantled the biological infrastructure of the world's oceans. The causes remain a subject of scientific discussion, but the most supported hypotheses point to a combination of factors. Massive volcanic activity releasing enormous quantities of carbon dioxide, followed by the explosive spread of land plants whose roots broke down rock and flooded shallow seas with nutrients, triggering runaway algal blooms that stripped the water of oxygen. The technical term for the result is anoxia, an ocean without enough oxygen to sustain complex animal life. For the creatures of the Devonian Sea, it was not a predator that killed them. It was the disappearance of the very conditions that made the ocean habitable. The placoderms did not survive it, not a single lineage. Every species of armored fish that had spent hundreds of millions of years evolving its plated architecture, every ecological variant of the group that had radiated across Devonian seas in extraordinary diversity, was gone by the time the Devonian boundary had passed. The most successful vertebrate group in the history of life up to that point, dominant, sophisticated, and abundant, was erased so completely that its closest surviving relatives are a matter of ongoing scientific debate. What the placoderms had built in terms of sheer biological investment was reduced to rock. Their armor, so effective against every predator the Devonian had produced, offered nothing against the slow withdrawal of oxygen from their world. The early sharks survived. Not all of them, and not without cost. The late Devonian extinction reduced shark diversity as well, eliminating a number of lineages that had been actively diversifying during the period's peak. But the fundamental design, light, flexible, metabolically efficient, adaptable in diet and habitat, proved more resilient than its armored competitors. Cartilage preserves poorly in the fossil record, which means the full picture of shark survival through this crisis is incomplete. But the lineage continued. The skeletal philosophy that sharks had committed to, which had seemed in the Devonian's abundance like simply one option among several, revealed itself under catastrophic conditions to be something more durable than armor had ever been. There is a particular kind of lesson embedded in this outcome that reaches beyond paleontology. The Devonian arms race was not won by the most heavily defended competitor. It was not won by the animal with the most powerful bite or the thickest plating or the most intimidating profile. It was won by the animal that carried the least unnecessary weight, that required the fewest resources to maintain, and that could adapt its behavior and diet when the ocean it had evolved within was suddenly restructured around it. Dunkleosteus was extraordinary. It was also, in the end, too expensive for a world that had stopped providing what it needed. The sharks were cheaper to run, and in a crisis, cheapness of operation is a form of genius. The ocean that emerged from the late Devonian extinction was quieter, emptier, and in many ways unrecognizable from what had come before. Its reefs were gone. Its dominant vertebrates were gone. The ecological roles that placoderms had filled were now vacant, and the world waited, as it always does after catastrophe, for something to move into the space that had been cleared. The sharks that had survived were not yet the dominant force they would become, but they were present. They were intact, and in the strange recovering ocean of the early Carboniferous, they were about to enter a period of diversification so dramatic and so unexpected that even scientists who have spent careers studying it find themselves searching for adequate language to describe what happened next. There is a moment in the history of life on Earth that stands apart from every other catastrophe in the fossil record. Not because of its drama, though the drama was extraordinary. Not because of its speed, though the pace of destruction was geological in its relentlessness. It stands apart because of its scale. Because what happened approximately 252 million years ago came closer to ending complex life on this planet than any event before or since. Scientists call it the Permian Triassic extinction. In the language of paleontology, it carries a grimmer name, the Great Dying. And that name, stripped of all scientific formality, is the most accurate description ever given to a geological event. Because what the boundary between the Permian and Triassic periods represents is not merely an extinction, it is the closest the biosphere of Earth has ever come to total silence. To understand the magnitude of what occurred, you need a reference point that the human mind can actually hold. The extinction event that ended the dinosaurs, the one caused by an asteroid impact 66 million years ago, the one that defines the popular imagination of prehistoric catastrophe, eliminated approximately 75% of all species on Earth. That number is staggering. It reshaped the planet permanently and handed dominance of terrestrial ecosystems to a group of small, warm-blooded animals that would eventually produce, among other things, the species now writing documentaries about it. The Cretaceous Paleogene extinction was one of the most severe biological collapses in Earth's history. It was not the worst. It was not even close. The Permian Triassic extinction killed an estimated 90 to 96% of all marine species. On land, somewhere between 70 and 80% of vertebrate genera were erased. The insect fossil record, which typically survives extinction events with relatively modest losses, shows evidence of severe collapse. Reef ecosystems, which had been rebuilding since the late Devonian crisis, were effectively eliminated again. The recovery time after previous major extinctions had been measured in millions of years. After the Great Dying, the oceans would require approximately 10 million years before anything resembling complex ecological structure returned. 10 million years of near biological silence in environments that had been continuously occupied by complex life for hundreds of millions of years before. The mechanism behind this catastrophe was not a single impact, not a single volcanic eruption, not any one identifiable moment of destruction. It was a cascade, a chain of interconnected planetary processes that, once set in motion, amplified one another toward a threshold that the biosphere could not absorb. The trigger, in the current scientific consensus, was the Siberian Traps, a volcanic province of almost incomprehensible scale, erupting over a period of perhaps 1 million years and releasing quantities of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere that dwarfed any volcanic event in the preceding geological record. The initial warming from this carbon injection raised global temperatures, but that was only the beginning of the cascade. As surface temperatures climbed, the deep ocean began to lose its stratification. The cold, dense, oxygen-rich water that normally sinks from polar regions and circulates through the ocean's depths began to slow. Without that circulation, the deep ocean became stagnant. Stagnant water becomes anoxic, stripped of the dissolved oxygen that marine life requires. And in anoxic conditions, a particular type of anaerobic bacteria flourishes, metabolizing the organic matter settling from above and releasing hydrogen sulfide as a byproduct. Hydrogen sulfide is toxic to aerobic life at concentrations far below what the deep ocean of the late Permian was producing. Evidence preserved in the rock record suggests that hydrogen sulfide may have bubbled up through the water column in quantities large enough to penetrate the atmosphere, adding a chemical toxicity to the thermal and hypoxic stresses already dismantling marine ecosystems. Simultaneously, the carbon dioxide being absorbed by the ocean was doing what dissolved carbon dioxide always does. It was forming carbonic acid. Ocean acidification during the Permian-Triassic boundary reduced the capacity of seawater to support the calcium carbonate structures on which reef-building organisms depend. Corals, brachiopods, echinoderms, entire groups of organisms whose body plans required a particular ocean chemistry, found themselves in a sea that had chemically reclassified itself as hostile. They died not from predation, not from competition, but from the slow dissolution of the conditions that made their existence possible. The ocean did not kill them with violence. It killed them by becoming a different ocean entirely. By the time the boundary had passed, the marine world that sharks had inhabited for nearly 200 million years was gone. The reefs were rubble. The diverse assemblages of fish and invertebrate life that had characterized Permian seas had been reduced to scattered survivors occupying a depleted, chemically unstable ocean that bore almost no resemblance to what it had been. The ecological roles that hundreds of thousands of species had filled were now empty. The food webs that had organized predation, competition, and energy flow through marine ecosystems had collapsed into something closer to a skeleton, a bare framework with almost nothing left to sustain the complexity that had once existed. Almost everything died, but not them. Shark survival through the Permian-Triassic extinction is not a simple story, and it would be dishonest to present it as a triumph without qualification. The shark fossil record from this boundary is frustratingly incomplete. Cartilage, as it does throughout the geological record, preserved poorly enough that reconstructing exactly which lineages survived and which were lost requires significant inference from isolated teeth and scales. What is clear is that shark diversity contracted severely. Several lineages that had been radiating through the Permian were gone by the Triassic. The extinction was not selective enough to leave the shark clade entirely unscathed. What it left was a reduced but intact lineage, a biological remnant carrying the essential design that had already proven its durability once before, at the end of the Devonian, and would now be called upon to prove it again under conditions far more severe. The question of why sharks survived when so much else did not returns, inevitably to the same structural logic that explained their persistence through the late Devonian. A cartilaginous skeleton demands less calcium to produce and maintain than a bony one, which matters enormously in an ocean whose chemistry no longer reliably supports calcium carbonate formation. Sharks are metabolically flexible in ways that many of their contemporaries were not. Capable of adjusting their activity levels, their dietary preferences, and their depth range in response to deteriorating conditions. Their electroreceptive sensory systems, the ampullae of Lorenzini that allow them to detect the electrical fields produced by other organisms, function in turbid, low-visibility water that would disorient purely visual predators. In the murky, chemically disrupted ocean of the early Triassic, the ability to locate prey without relying on clear water was not a secondary advantage. It was the difference between finding food and starving. There is also the matter of reproductive strategy. Sharks reproduce slowly by the standards of most fish, producing few offspring, investing more in each one, relying on long lifespans to accumulate reproductive success across multiple years. This strategy is typically a vulnerability in stable, competitive ecosystems, where rapid reproducers can outpace slower ones. But in a post-extinction environment, the calculus shifts. When resources are scarce and competition has been catastrophically reduced, an animal that requires relatively little to sustain itself and that carries a high-quality biological design into a largely empty ecological landscape has room to expand that design without the pressure of immediately encountering a superior competitor. The early Triassic ocean was not abundant, but it was, for the organisms that survived into it, open in a way that it had not been for hundreds of millions of years. The diversification that followed in the Triassic and into the Jurassic was not gradual. It was explosive by geological standards, a radiation of shark forms into ecological roles that the extinction had vacated, producing body plans and behavioral strategies that the Permian Ocean had never seen. Hybodont sharks, which had been present since at least the Carboniferous, expanded dramatically into the post-extinction recovery period, filling niches across both open ocean and shallow water environments. Later, as the Triassic gave way to the Jurassic and ocean chemistry continued to stabilize, the lineages that would eventually produce the sharks recognizable to modern eyes began to appear in the record. The Neoselachians, the group that includes every living shark species today. Their emergence in the Mesozoic was not a beginning. It was a continuation of a lineage that had already been running for 200 million years before they arrived. On land, during this same interval, the world was doing its own slow rebuilding. The terrestrial ecosystems devastated by the Permian extinction were being resettled by the Archosaurs, the group that would eventually give rise to the crocodilians and to the dinosaurs. The first true dinosaurs appear in the fossil record approximately 20 to 30 million years after the Permian-Triassic boundary, emerging into a world still recovering from the worst biological crisis it had ever endured. They would go on to become the dominant terrestrial vertebrates for the next 165 million years, and their story would become the story that fills museums and textbooks and the popular imagination of prehistoric life. But while that story was unfolding on land, in the shallow seas and open oceans surrounding every continent, sharks were already doing what they had been doing for hundreds of millions of years, hunting, adapting, and quietly ensuring that their lineage would outlast whatever came next. The pattern that emerges from these two great extinctions is not a coincidence. It is an argument. The Devonian crisis eliminated the armored fish and left the sharks. The Permian crisis eliminated nearly everything that had come after the armored fish and still left the sharks. Two of the most severe biological collapses in the history of complex life on Earth, separated by nearly 200 million years, producing the same fundamental result. There is a design logic to the shark body plan that the extinction record has tested repeatedly, under radically different conditions, and each time found sufficient. That is not luck. That is not circumstance. It is the most rigorous form of validation that biology possesses. The verdict of catastrophe, rendered twice in favor of the same basic animal. What that animal looked like as it moved through the recovering oceans of the Mesozoic, how it refined itself across the Jurassic and Cretaceous, and what it eventually became as the age of dinosaurs rose and fell around it. That is the next chapter of a story that, by any measure, deserves to be told in full. There is a particular kind of clarity that comes from standing at the edge of two empires and watching them build themselves simultaneously, each unaware of the other's full significance. Approximately 230 million years ago, in the upland plains and river valleys of what would eventually become South America and later spread across a connected world, a group of small bipedal archosaurs was beginning to diversify into something that no terrestrial ecosystem had yet produced. They were not impressive by the standards of what they would become. Lightly built, fast-moving, occupying the margins of ecosystems still dominated by other reptile groups. But the body plan they carried contained a structural promise that the Triassic world had not yet learned to read. These were the first dinosaurs, and the world they were inheriting on land was still raw and half-recovered, a terrestrial ecosystem rebuilding itself on the wreckage of the Great Dying, full of vacant niches and ecological opportunity that their lineage would spend the next 200 million years claiming. In the ocean, at precisely the same moment in geological time, this drama of emergence was invisible. The seas of the early and middle Triassic were not waiting for the dinosaurs to evolve. They were already occupied, already reorganizing under the direction of predators that had survived the Permian extinction, and were now pressing into the ecological space the catastrophe had cleared. The sharks among them were not dramatic in the way that would be required to earn attention in a world also producing giants on land. They were methodical, they were persistent, and they were once again in the process of becoming something more diverse than they had been before the world tried to destroy them. To understand what the Mesozoic ocean looked like when the dinosaurs were still small and tentative terrestrial newcomers, you have to populate it correctly. The Triassic seas were not yet the complex reef-structured environments of the Jurassic that would follow. They were recovering systems, gradually rebuilding the ecological scaffolding that the Great Dying had demolished, slowly filling the water column with life forms capable of sustaining the predator guilds that a healthy ocean requires. Into this recovering world, the Hybodont sharks expanded with a thoroughness that the fossil record, even with its limitations, documents clearly. Hybodonts had been present since at least the Carboniferous, a lineage that had persisted through the Permian extinction, with enough biological integrity to radiate broadly once conditions permitted. In the Triassic recovery, they became one of the defining vertebrate groups of the marine environment. Diverse in body size, flexible in diet, capable of occupying both open water and shallow nearshore habitats in ways that made them ecologically difficult to displace. Hybodont itself, the genus that gives the group its common name, was a shark of considerable sophistication by any period standard. It carried two types of teeth simultaneously: sharp, pointed teeth suited to catching agile, fast-moving prey, and broader, flattened teeth capable of crushing hard-shelled invertebrates. This dental flexibility is not a minor detail. It is the biological signature of an animal that had solved the problem of dietary dependency by refusing to commit to a single food source. In an ocean still rebuilding its prey base, an apex or mesopredator that can shift its feeding strategy depending on what is available is not merely adaptable. It is structurally insulated against the kind of resource collapses that eliminate more specialized hunters. Hybodont was also capable of tolerating freshwater environments, with fossils recovered from what were clearly river and lake systems, suggesting a physiological range that extended beyond the marine environments where most of its relatives were concentrated. The same design philosophy that had carried sharks through two extinction events, flexibility, metabolic efficiency, reduced dependence on specific environmental conditions, was still operating, still being refined, still producing solutions that the changing world kept finding adequate. The Jurassic period, beginning approximately 200 million years ago, brought the recovery that the Triassic had been building toward. Reef systems returned. The oceans warmed and stratified into productive zones. The diversity of marine invertebrates recovered to levels not seen since the Permian, providing the prey base necessary to support a fully structured food web. And into this recovering abundance came not only the sharks, now diversifying more rapidly than they had since the Carboniferous, but a new category of predator that the ocean had not previously seen: the marine reptiles. Their arrival did not displace the sharks. What it did was create something ecologically more interesting and more instructive than simple competition. The Ichthyosaurs were already ancient by the Jurassic's peak. They had first appeared in the early Triassic, possibly even the late Permian, and by the time the Jurassic seas had fully organized themselves, they had evolved into a body plan of extraordinary convergence. Dolphin-like in external form, with large eyes adapted for deep water vision, tail flukes oriented horizontally in contrast to the vertical tail of a shark, and feeding strategies suited to pursuing fast-moving cephalopods and fish in open water environments. They were not sharks, but they occupied similar ecological space in the open ocean, pursuing similar prey using different mechanical solutions to the same hydrodynamic problems. Their presence should, in theory, have produced direct competition with the sharks that had been occupying those same water columns for far longer. It largely did not. The reason returns to a concept that the shark lineage had been demonstrating through its entire evolutionary history, without anyone on land being present to observe it. Ecological layering. Sharks did not need to win a direct confrontation with every predator that entered their environment. They needed only to find a position within the ecosystem's structure from which they could feed, reproduce, and persist. Against the Ichthyosaurs, which excelled in open water pursuit of fast, evasive prey, many shark lineages concentrated their activity in the reef margins, the benthic zones, and the transitional habitats between open water and coastal structure, where the marine reptiles were less well adapted to operate. This was not retreat. It was differentiation. The same biological process that allows multiple predator species to coexist in modern ecosystems by partitioning the available resources along lines of behavioral and anatomical specialization. The Plesiosaurs presented a different ecological profile. Long-necked, large-bodied, with paddle limbs that generated propulsion through a flying motion, rather than the oscillation that drives most fish locomotion, they were animals of the mid-water column in the open sea, capable of reaching considerable depths and operating in the spaces between the surface and the seafloor, with a range that most contemporaries could not match. Some lineages, the Pliosaurs among them, became the largest active predators the Mesozoic ocean produced, with skull lengths exceeding 2 meters in the most extreme specimens, and jaw forces that place them at the absolute apex of Jurassic marine food webs. In any environment that contained a pliosaur, the pliosaur was the dominant predator. And yet the sharks persisted alongside them, occupying the ecological layers that the pliosaur's size and behavioral tendencies left available, continuing to diversify, continuing to refine the Neoselachian lineages that were now producing the first ancestors of modern shark families. It was during the Jurassic that the Neoselachians, the group that contains every living shark, ray, and skate, began their substantial diversification. Earlier Selachian forms had been present since the Triassic and possibly the Permian, but the Jurassic fossil record shows a clear acceleration in the appearance of body plans and dental configurations that resemble, in broad outline, the sharks that populate modern oceans. The first relatives of the modern carpet sharks appear in this period. Early forms ancestral to the bullhead sharks, with their characteristic crushing dentition and bottom-associated habits, were present in Jurassic reef environments. The structural diversification of the Neoselachians during this period was not a replacement of older forms. Hybodonts persisted well into the Cretaceous, but an expansion of the shark clade's total ecological reach, filling roles across a broader range of habitats and feeding strategies than any earlier radiation had achieved. Then the Cretaceous brought the Mosasaurs, and the dynamic shifted again. The Mosasaurs were not like the Ichthyosaurs or the Plesiosaurs. They were varanid lizards, relatives of the monitor lizards of the present day, that had entered the ocean and undergone a rapid and dramatic transformation into fully marine predators. By the late Cretaceous, some lineages had become enormous. Mosasaurus itself reached lengths of up to 14 meters. Tylosaurus approached similar dimensions, and both were built for a style of predation that was direct, powerful, and ecologically comprehensive. Mosasaurs ate fish, ammonites, other marine reptiles, seabirds, and almost certainly sharks. The evidence for the last comes not from observed behavior, but from bite marks on fossil shark vertebrae and teeth, which carry the distinctive patterns of mosasaur dentition. The apex of the late Cretaceous ocean was not occupied by a shark. It was occupied by a lizard that had taught itself to swim, and it was large enough and aggressive enough to prey upon the animals that had been dominant in that environment for the better part of 400 million years. This is the moment in the shark story that most histories either omit or minimize, because it complicates the narrative of unbroken dominance. The sharks of the late Cretaceous were not apex predators in the conventional sense. They were operating beneath the mosasaurs in the ecological hierarchy, skilled, diverse, and persistent, but not supreme. What they demonstrated during this period was not dominance, but something potentially more impressive: the capacity to function effectively as mesopredators, to sustain their lineage's diversity and distribution in an ecosystem where something larger and more powerful occupied the top position, and to do so without the kind of specialization that would make them dependent on specific prey or specific conditions. They were flexible enough to survive being temporarily not the most dangerous thing in the water. When the asteroid struck 66 million years ago and the Cretaceous ended, the Mosasaurs died. The Plesiosaurs died. The non-avian dinosaurs on land died. The marine reptiles that had shared, competed with, and preyed upon sharks for over 150 million years were gone in a geological instant, eliminated by the same environmental collapse. Impact winter, global darkness, the collapse of photosynthetic food chains that restructured every ecosystem on Earth. The sharks survived. For the third time in their history, they had outlasted a world that had ended. And the ocean that opened before them in the early Paleogene, emptied once again of its largest predators, was a space they had occupied in one form or another for nearly 400 million years. They knew what to do with it. The question of what they did with it, how the extinction of every marine reptile and the subsequent reorganization of the ocean's ecological structure produced the sharks that eventually swam into waters that human beings would one day enter, belongs to the next stage of this story. But the outline of the answer is already present in everything the fossil record has shown. Sharks do not require stability. They do not require the absence of competition. They do not require the ocean to remain constant, or the climate to cooperate, or the other great predators of their era to leave them alone. What they require is only what they have always required: water, prey, and enough biological flexibility to find both. Every extinction event in the Phanerozoic record has tested whether that requirement is sufficient. Every one of them has returned the same answer. There are events in the history of this planet that do not require embellishment. Their scale is already beyond what language was designed to carry, and the temptation when approaching them is always to reach for the most extreme phrasing available, to stack superlatives until the reader feels the weight of what happened. But the Chicxulub impact does not need that treatment. The facts, stated plainly, are sufficient. On a morning approximately 66 million years ago, a rock roughly 12 kilometers in diameter, traveling at somewhere between 20 and 30 kilometers per second, entered Earth's atmosphere at a shallow angle and struck the shallow carbonate platform of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The energy released by that impact has been estimated at roughly 1 billion times the yield of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The crater it produced was approximately 180 kilometers across. The column of vaporized rock and superheated gas it ejected into the atmosphere reached beyond the stratosphere within seconds, and in the hours, days, weeks, months, and years that followed, the consequences of that single geological moment cascaded through every ecosystem on Earth, with a thoroughness that the planet had not experienced since the Great Dying. The immediate effects were catastrophic in ways that varied by distance from the impact site. The initial blast radius was absolute. Nothing within a certain zone survived the pressure wave and the thermal pulse that followed. The shallow sea surrounding the impact point was displaced by mega tsunamis that sent walls of water across coastlines thousands of kilometers away, with evidence of their reach preserved in sedimentary layers across North America, Europe, and beyond. The ejecta thrown into the upper atmosphere by the impact, a mixture of pulverized rock, condensed vapor, and superheated debris, re-entered the atmosphere across the entire planet within hours, and the frictional heating generated by that re-entry has been estimated to have been sufficient to ignite wildfires on a global scale. The sky, in the hours following the impact, may have functioned as a broiler. Animals that could not shelter underground or underwater from the thermal pulse had little protection. The land surface of Earth in the hours immediately following the Chicxulub impact was arguably the least survivable place on the planet. The ocean offered insulation, not immunity. The marine environment was about to experience one of the most severe collapses in its history, but insulation against the specific immediate terrors that the impact's thermal effects visited on the land surface. Water absorbs and distributes heat. Depth provides protection from radiation and fire that no land animal without a burrow could access. The creatures of the ocean did not experience the first hours of the Chicxulub aftermath the way the dinosaurs did. What they experienced instead was something slower, more systematic, and in many ways more total. The progressive dismantling of the photosynthetic base that had organized marine food webs for hundreds of millions of years. The mechanism was darkness. The ejecta cloud, combined with the soot from global wildfires and the sulfur dioxide released from the vaporized carbonate and evaporate rocks at the impact site, formed an atmospheric veil dense enough to block the sunlight required for photosynthesis. Estimates of the duration of this darkness vary, but even the most conservative place it in the range of months, with partial light reduction persisting for years. For land plants, this meant mass death. For the phytoplankton that form the base of marine food chains, it meant the same. And when phytoplankton die, everything that depends on them, the zooplankton that graze on them, the small fish and invertebrates that feed on the zooplankton, the larger predators that feed on those, collapses in sequence from the bottom upward with a thoroughness that is proportional to how completely the foundation has been removed. The ammonites, among the most abundant and ecologically important marine invertebrates of the Cretaceous, were gone within a geologically brief interval after the impact. Their disappearance is one of the clearest markers of the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary in the fossil record. Abundant and diverse in the layers below the boundary clay, entirely absent above it. The Mosasaurs, which had spent the late Cretaceous at the absolute apex of marine predation, did not survive. The Plesiosaurs, which had persisted in the ocean for over 130 million years through the reorganizations of the Triassic and Jurassic, were gone. The marine reptiles that had coexisted with, competed with, and preyed upon sharks for the entire duration of the Mesozoic were eliminated with a completeness that matched the extinction of the dinosaurs on land. The ocean that had been one of the most complex and predator-dense environments in Earth's history was, above a certain ecological threshold, suddenly and catastrophically emptied. The question that the shark story has been building toward for 400 million years of geological time now arrived at its third great test. Would the lineage that had survived the late Devonian extinction and the great dying of the Permian survive a third planetary catastrophe? The answer that the fossil record provides is the same answer it provided the first two times, but it arrives with additional nuance. Because the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction was not kind to sharks either, and presenting their survival as effortless or total would misrepresent both the severity of what occurred and the biological reality of what it takes to endure a mass extinction. Shark diversity contracted significantly across the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. Several lineages that had been well established in Cretaceous seas disappeared from the fossil record at or near the boundary and do not reappear. The Hybodont sharks, which had been present since the Carboniferous and had persisted through the Permian extinction and the entire Mesozoic alongside the Neoselachians, did not survive into the Paleogene. Their disappearance after more than 250 million years of continuous presence in the fossil record is one of the significant losses at this boundary, and it underlines the point that shark survival through extinction events is not a guarantee extended equally to all members of the clade. What survived was not sharks in their entirety. What survived was the Neoselachian lineage, the group that had been diversifying through the Jurassic and Cretaceous, and that contained within its biological range the flexibility and dietary breadth to weather the collapse of the Cretaceous food web. The specific traits that allowed Neoselachians to survive, where others did not return, again, to the same cluster of biological characteristics that the extinction record has been validating since the Devonian. Dietary opportunism was paramount. The collapse of the phytoplankton base did not eliminate all marine food sources simultaneously. It disrupted the most sunlight-dependent pathways first, leaving deeper water ecosystems, chemosynthetic communities, and detrital food chains temporarily more intact than the surface-dependent food webs that most large Cretaceous predators relied upon. Sharks capable of feeding on carrion, on invertebrates, on prey at depth, and on whatever the disrupted ocean made available were better positioned than predators whose hunting strategies depended on specific prey types that the extinction had removed. The flexibility that had looked like a generalist compromise in times of ecological abundance revealed itself once more as a precision adaptation for surviving the moments when abundance ended. Reproductive biology played a role as well. The collapse of large, highly specialized top predators in any ecosystem typically creates conditions that favor organisms with shorter generation times and higher reproductive rates. Smaller animals that can rebuild population numbers more rapidly in recovering environments. Sharks do not fit that profile neatly. They are slow reproducers by the standards of most fish. But the Neoselachians that survived the boundary included lineages across a range of body sizes, and smaller-bodied sharks with more frequent reproductive cycles were better positioned to recover population numbers in the disrupted early Paleogene than the large-bodied specialists that had dominated late Cretaceous seas. The diversity within the Neoselachian clade, accumulated across the Mesozoic, functioned as a kind of biological portfolio. And when the extinction event reduced that portfolio, enough remained to sustain the lineage through the recovery period. What the early Paleogene ocean looked like from the perspective of a surviving shark is difficult to reconstruct with precision, but the broad outlines are available. It was an ocean missing its largest predators. The Mosasaurs were gone. The Plesiosaurs were gone. The large cephalopod diversity that had sustained many of them was severely reduced. The reef systems that had provided structural complexity to Cretaceous marine ecosystems were in various states of collapse or rebuilding. The surviving sharks moved through a water column that was, relative to what it had been, almost empty of competition at the upper end of the size range. The ecological vacuum created by the removal of the marine reptiles was not filled instantaneously. The ocean does not reorganize quickly by human timescales, but the direction of that reorganization, over the millions of years of the Paleogene, was shaped in significant part by the sharks that had survived into it, and were now, for the third time in their evolutionary history, the inheritors of a world that catastrophe had cleared. The radiation that followed was the one that produced the sharks that a human being, standing at the ocean's edge in the present day, might actually recognize. The ancestor of the great white shark traces its lineage through forms that appear in the Paleogene record. The lineages that would produce the hammerheads, the tiger sharks, the oceanic whitetips, the animals that have defined the human understanding of what a shark is, were diversifying and establishing themselves in the Eocene and Oligocene seas of the post-extinction recovery. The largest shark that has ever existed, Fall of Megalodon, emerged from this post-extinction radiation as well, reaching body lengths estimated between 15 and 20 meters, and occupying an ecological position at the absolute apex of Neogene marine food webs that nothing in the modern ocean currently matches. The arc from the first fragmentary shark scales of the Ordovician to the Megalodon cruising Miocene seas spans more than 400 million years and crosses 3 of the 5 great mass extinctions in the Phanerozoic record. Each extinction removed competitors. Each extinction contracted shark diversity before the recovery expanded it again. Each extinction tested the biological logic of the cartilaginous, flexible, opportunistic design that the shark lineage had committed to in the earliest chapters of vertebrate evolution, and each time that test was administered under conditions that eliminated the majority of complex marine life, the same design passed. The Mosasaurs failed. The Plesiosaurs failed. The non-avian dinosaurs failed, the sharks did not. There is a word that gets applied to organisms that survive across geological time with their fundamental design intact, and that word is success. But it is worth pausing on what kind of success the shark fossil record actually documents. It is not the success of dominance. There were long periods when sharks were not the largest or most powerful predators in their environment. It is not the success of stability. The shark body plan has changed substantially across 400 million years, branching into thousands of species with wildly different ecologies and adaptations. The success that sharks document is something more austere and more instructive than either of those. It is the success of sufficiency, of a biological architecture that, across every variety of catastrophe the planet has produced, remained sufficient for the task of continuing. They had outlived another empire. They had outlived every empire. And the ocean that opened before them in the Paleogene was, in the deepest sense, not new territory. It was home, cleared once more, and waiting. What that home eventually produced, how the post-extinction radiation of the Neoselachians gave rise to the specific animals that now represent the shark lineage in the modern ocean, and what 400 million years of accumulated evolutionary refinement actually looks like in the biology of a living shark, is where this story arrives next. The world that emerged from the Chicxulub aftermath was not the world that had preceded it. The Paleogene ocean was a diminished space, not in volume, not in chemistry that would eventually restabilize, but in the biological complexity that had taken hundreds of millions of years to accumulate, and had been reduced in the span of geological moments to something closer to its earliest drafts. The food webs were simplified. The apex predator guilds were vacant. The reef systems that had structured shallow water ecosystems through the Cretaceous were rebuilding from organisms that had survived the boundary in reduced and scattered populations. To a human observer dropped into the early Eocene ocean, the surface impression would have been one of relative quiet. A sea that was productive enough to sustain life but had not yet reassembled the layered, competitive complexity of what the Mesozoic had built. Beneath that surface, in the water column and along the continental shelves, the Neoselachian sharks that had carried their lineage through the extinction were doing what their ancestors had done after every previous catastrophe. They were expanding into the space that had been cleared for them. The Paleogene radiation of sharks produced lineages of extraordinary diversity across a time interval that, by the standards of vertebrate evolution, was remarkably compressed. The Eocene and Oligocene epochs saw the establishment of most of the major Neoselachian families that persist into the present day. The lamnids, the carcharhinids, the spherinids, the orictolobids, each representing a distinct solution to the problem of being a shark in a particular ecological context, and each carrying within its biology the accumulated refinements of a lineage that had been pressure-tested by 400 million years of planetary upheaval. The diversification was not random. It tracked the recovery of the marine food web with a precision that reflects how tightly shark evolution has always been coupled to the availability of structured prey communities. As bony fish diversity expanded in the Paleogene, as marine mammals entered the ocean and brought with them a rich new category of high-calorie prey, as the reef systems rebuilt and the mid-water food chains restabilized, the sharks that could best exploit each new resource category were the lineages that expanded most rapidly. Evolution, working on a clade of extraordinary biological flexibility, produced a range of forms that covered nearly every available ecological role in the recovering ocean. But it was in the Miocene that the shark lineage reached what may be its most extreme expression in terms of raw biological scale. The genus Otodus, which had first appeared in the Paleocene with body lengths in the range of modern large lamnid sharks, had been slowly increasing in body size across the Eocene and Oligocene through a series of transitional forms that the fossil record documents in teeth of progressively larger dimension. By the Miocene, the lineage had produced Otodus megalodon, an animal so far outside the size range of anything currently living in the ocean that even the conservative end of body length estimates places it in a category that the modern world simply does not contain. Estimates derived from scaling relationships between tooth size and body length in modern lamnid sharks place megalodon at between 15 and 20 meters, with some analyses of larger specimens suggesting lengths approaching the upper end of that range. The teeth themselves are the primary evidence, and they are extraordinary objects. Triangular, serrated, and reaching heights of up to 18 centimeters in the largest specimens, roughly 3 times the height of the largest teeth produced by a great white shark. What Megalodon ate and how its hunting behavior was organized is inferred from the fossil record with the careful uncertainty that all behavioral paleontology requires. Bite marks on fossil whale bones, distributed in patterns consistent with attacks on the tail region, a strategy that would immobilize large prey before delivering a killing bite, suggest a predator sophisticated enough to have developed prey-specific attack strategies rather than simply charging its target directly. The Miocene ocean was rich in cetaceans of moderate size, and Megalodon appears to have positioned itself as the dominant predator of that prey category in the warm, shallow seas it preferred. It was not a deep-water animal. Its teeth are found predominantly in association with coastal and shelf environments, suggesting a distribution tied to the productive shallow water zones where whale populations were concentrated. For roughly 3.5 million years, from the early Miocene into the Pliocene, it occupied an ecological position that nothing else in the ocean could contest. Then it was gone. The reasons for Megalodon's extinction are still actively debated in the scientific literature, and the debate is complicated by the absence of soft tissue preservation and the fragmentary nature of the tooth record in the relevant time interval. The leading hypotheses point to a convergence of factors during the late Pliocene: a global cooling trend that contracted the warm, shallow seas Megalodon preferred, a reorganization of whale migration patterns as ocean temperatures shifted that may have reduced prey availability in the regions Megalodon occupied, and possibly the emergence of competing apex predators, including the great white shark and early populations of killer whales, capable of targeting the same prey base. The extinction of Megalodon was not a catastrophe in the planetary sense. There was no asteroid, no volcanic winter, no ocean anoxia. It was an ecological displacement, a large and specialized predator removed from its niche by the gradual restructuring of the environment it depended on. The irony is not lost on any careful reading of the shark fossil record. The lineage that had survived 5 planetary mass extinctions lost one of its most spectacular members to a period of gradual change that would barely register as a disturbance by the standards of the Permian or the Devonian. Megalodon was extraordinary. It was also in the end specialized enough that the specific conditions it required were not sufficiently flexible to accommodate a cooling world. The sharks that remained were a different kind of demonstration of the lineage's persistence. Not spectacular in scale, not occupying a single unchallenged apex position, but distributed across every ocean on Earth in forms ranging from the 2-centimeter dwarf lantern shark to the 12-meter whale shark, the largest fish currently alive, and covering ecological roles from deep-sea scavenging to open ocean pursuit predation to benthic filter feeding. The modern shark fauna represents not a single evolutionary strategy but a portfolio of strategies, each refined over tens of millions of years, collectively covering a range of ecological function that no other vertebrate group in the marine environment approaches in breadth. What unifies these diverse forms beneath their external differences is a set of biological innovations so thoroughly integrated into the shark body plan that they are difficult to separate from the animal itself, but which, when examined individually, reveal the depth of evolutionary engineering the lineage has accumulated. The electroreceptive system, the ampullae of Lorenzini, a network of gel-filled canals distributed across the snout and head, allows sharks to detect the minute electrical fields generated by the muscle contractions of living organisms at ranges that vary by species and water conductivity, but can extend to distances that make concealment by prey essentially impossible in close quarters. Every living animal produces an electrical field. The shark's sensory system converts that universal biological signature into navigational and predatory information that functions independently of light, water clarity, or any of the other environmental variables that limit the sensory reach of purely visual or acoustic hunters. The lateral line system extends this sensory architecture into a different physical domain. The detection of pressure waves and water displacement that propagates from moving objects through the surrounding medium. A shark moving through water is receiving continuous information about the movement of everything within a significant radius, gathered through a system that operates below the threshold of conscious attention in the way that human proprioception does, automatically, constantly, and with a specificity that allows the animal to distinguish the displacement pattern of an injured fish from that of a healthy one at distances sufficient to orient a pursuit before visual confirmation is possible. These are not supplementary senses that assist the shark when other systems fail. They are primary sensory channels that define how the animal constructs its understanding of its environment, and they represent evolutionary refinements accumulated across a time span that makes human sensory evolution look preliminary. Reproductive strategies across the modern shark fauna cover a range that reflects the diversity of environments and ecological conditions the lineage has colonized. Some species are oviparous, laying eggs in protective cases that develop externally over months. A strategy suited to stable environments where the juvenile can develop undisturbed before hatching with enough biological preparation to survive initial exposure to predation. Others are viviparous, gestating live young internally, with some species providing nourishment through a placental connection structurally analogous to the mammalian placenta, despite representing a completely independent evolutionary development. In certain species, the most extreme form of prenatal investment produces pups that are already apex predators at birth. The sand tiger shark's intrauterine cannibalism, in which the most developed embryo consumes its siblings before birth, delivers a newborn that has already demonstrated competitive superiority to every other individual in its cohort. These reproductive strategies are not curiosities. They are the mechanisms by which a slow reproducing lineage has managed population continuity across geological time, ensuring that each generation carries sufficient biological quality into the next. The survival of sharks across 5 mass extinctions, the late Ordovician, the late Devonian, the Permian Triassic, the Triassic Jurassic, and the Cretaceous Paleogene, is the kind of statistic that sounds impressive, and then when its full implication settles, becomes something more unsettling than impressive. 5 times the conditions that support complex life on Earth have been disrupted severely enough to eliminate the majority of species present. 5 times, the shark lineage has carried its fundamental design across the boundary and continued. The late Ordovician glaciation eliminated perhaps 85% of species. The late Devonian crisis collapsed the armored fish empires. The Great Dying reduced marine species by 90 to 96%. The Triassic-Jurassic event restructured terrestrial and marine ecosystems simultaneously. The Chicxulub impact ended the Mesozoic. Through all of it, something descended from those first Ordovician scale-bearers continued to swim in whatever ocean the planet still had to offer. That is not a record that any other vertebrate lineage approaches. It is, by the most rigorous available measure, the longest continuous demonstration of adaptive success in the vertebrate fossil record. What the modern ocean contains, then, is not merely a collection of species that happen to be living at the same time as human civilization. It contains the living expression of 450 million years of evolutionary refinement. Animals whose sensory architecture, skeletal design, and behavioral flexibility have been tested against every variety of planetary catastrophe that geological time has produced and found, repeatedly, to be sufficient. The great white shark cruising the cold upwelling zones of the Pacific is not a primitive animal that evolution neglected to update. It is a highly derived, exquisitely calibrated predator, carrying within its biology the accumulated solutions to problems that most lineages did not survive long enough to encounter. The whale shark filtering plankton in tropical waters is not a simple animal doing a simple thing. It is the current expression of a lineage that was already ancient when the first fish developed jaws. The length of that lineage is the most important fact about sharks, and it is the fact that the human relationship with these animals has most consistently failed to hold in view. We have defined them by fear, by spectacle, by the drama of encounters that represent a vanishingly small fraction of the reality of their existence. We have treated their presence in the modern ocean as a given, as background, as danger, as resource, without fully registering what it means that they are present at all. To understand what it means requires the perspective that this entire story has been building toward. Not the perspective of a single human lifetime, or a century, or even a millennium, but the perspective of deep time, of geological epochs, of a planet that has repeatedly tried, through its own catastrophic processes, to erase what it had built and found each time that the sharks remained. What that persistence demands from the only species in the ocean's history capable of choosing what survives next is a question that the final chapter of this story cannot avoid. 450 million years. That number has appeared in various forms throughout this story, and by now it may have lost some of its capacity to register as the extraordinary measurement it actually is. So consider it one final time from a different angle. 450 million years ago, the most complex life on land was a thin biological crust of early plants and fungi beginning to colonize the margins of ancient shorelines. The oceans that covered most of Earth's surface were already populated by the earliest ancestors of the lineage this story has followed. In the interval between that moment and this one, the continents have rearranged themselves completely. The atmosphere has been chemically transformed multiple times. The planet has frozen to its equator and thawed again. 5 mass extinction events have dismantled the complexity of life so severely that each one required tens of millions of years of recovery before the biosphere resembled what it had been before. Through all of that, through every configuration of ocean chemistry, ocean temperature, ocean ecology that the planet's turbulent history has produced, sharks persisted. Not unchanged, not without loss, not through any single dramatic act of biological heroism, but through the quiet, compounding logic of a design that remained adequate to every demand the planet made of it. That persistence is what makes what is happening now so difficult to process without a kind of intellectual vertigo. The threat that the shark lineage currently faces did not arrive as an asteroid. It did not build over millions of years of volcanic activity. It did not manifest as a slow withdrawal of oxygen from the world's oceans, or a collapse of photosynthetic food chains, or a chemical transformation of the sea that dissolved the biological infrastructure of an era. The current threat arrived within a single human lifetime. In geological terms, it is not even visible yet. It is so recent that the rock record will not contain its signature for millions of years, if there are organisms present to read that record when it does. And yet, the damage it is producing is measurable, documented, and accelerating in ways that the 5 mass extinctions in the fossil record did not manage in their early phases. The numbers are not abstract. Global shark populations have declined by an estimated 70 to 80% over the past 50 years. Some species that were abundant within the memory of living marine biologists are now functionally absent from ocean regions they historically dominated. The oceanic white-tip shark, once described by Jacques Cousteau as potentially the most numerous large animal on Earth, has declined by an estimated 98% in the Gulf of Mexico alone. The scalloped hammerhead, a species whose schooling behavior and distinctive morphology made it one of the most recognizable sharks in the ocean, is classified as critically endangered across much of its former range. The shortfin mako, the fastest shark alive whose speed and hydrodynamic refinement represent tens of millions of years of lamnid evolution, is being removed from the ocean faster than it can reproduce. These are not peripheral species at the edge of their ecological viability. These are the core members of the Neoselachian lineage that emerged from the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction and rebuilt the shark presence in the modern ocean across 66 million years of post-extinction recovery. The mechanisms driving these declines are not mysterious and not disputed. Commercial fishing removes an estimated 70 to 100 million sharks from the ocean annually, a figure so large that it has no meaningful parallel in the geological record of predator removal. Shark finning, The practice of removing the fins, used primarily as an ingredient in luxury soup, and discarding the still-living body at sea, represents one of the most ecologically wasteful forms of extraction in the history of human resource use, targeting the highest value body part of an animal that produces few offspring and requires years to reach reproductive maturity. Bycatch, the incidental capture of sharks and fishing gear targeting other species, adds an additional layer of mortality that is less visible in trade statistics, but no less real in its ecological impact. Habitat destruction in coastal zones is degrading the nursery environments that juvenile sharks require, compressing the reproductive success of species whose population recovery depends on survival rates that industrial fishing has already pushed below sustainable thresholds. The ecological consequences of removing apex predators from marine systems are not theoretical. They are documented in real time in ocean systems around the world. The concept of a trophic cascade, the reorganization of an entire food web that follows from the removal of its upper levels, has been studied in enough real-world cases to establish, beyond reasonable scientific doubt, that the absence of large sharks does not simply leave an ecological vacuum at the top of the food chain. It restructures everything below. Prey species populations expand beyond the limits that predation formerly imposed, placing unsustainable pressure on the organisms they consume, which in turn affects the organisms dependent on those, in a sequence of ecological displacement that eventually reaches the reef structures and seagrass beds and phytoplankton communities that form the productive foundation of the marine world. The shark is not merely a predator in its ecosystem. It is a regulatory mechanism, a biological control that the system evolved around over hundreds of millions of years, and whose removal the system was never designed to accommodate. What makes this moment uniquely strange in the context of the story this documentary has told is not simply the speed of the damage or its scale. It is the fact that it is being inflicted by an agent capable of understanding exactly what it is doing. Every previous threat that sharks faced, every extinction event, every ocean anoxia, every impact winter, was the product of planetary processes operating without awareness of their consequences. The Siberian traps did not know they were acidifying the ocean. The Chicxulub impactor did not choose its trajectory. The forces that drove shark diversity to its historical low points at each mass extinction boundary were indifferent to the lineage they were testing. The force currently reducing shark populations across every ocean on Earth is the only one in 450 million years of shark history that has been capable at every step of choosing differently. That asymmetry carries a weight that is difficult to locate in the vocabulary of either science or ethics, but which the facts of the situation press toward regardless. A lineage that outlasted the armored empires of the Devonian, that crossed the boundary of the Great Dying when 96% of marine species did not, that continued through the Mesozoic alongside creatures of extraordinary power and survived the impact that ended them. This lineage is now measurably losing ground to a species that has existed for less than 300,000 years, and that has been industrially harvesting the ocean for less than 2 centuries. The contrast between what sharks endured before human civilization existed and what they are losing within it is not merely a conservation statistic. It is a data point about the nature of the force that human industrial activity represents. A force that, by the standard of the geological record, is the most efficient predator of biological diversity that the planet has ever produced. The title of this documentary frames the shark story around time. the 100 million years before dinosaurs, during which sharks already ruled the ocean. But the more accurate framing, the one that the full arc of this story supports, is not about the past at all. It is about what persists. Sharks did not rule the ocean for a period, and then yield their dominance in the way that empires yield. Through conquest, through displacement, through the arrival of something more powerful that ended their reign. They adapted. They endured. They occupied whatever ecological position the changing ocean made available to them, and held it through conditions that no other vertebrate lineage in the history of this planet has survived intact. They are, by the only measure that deep time offers the most successful large predators the vertebrate fossil record contains. Whether they survive the current century is a question that the geological record cannot answer. It is the only question in the entire 450 million year span of this story whose answer is genuinely undecided. The only point at which the outcome is not already written in stone, waiting to be read. The sharks that still move through the deep ocean today are the living inheritance of every extinction the planet has survived. What happens to them now will not be the result of a volcanic winter, or an oxygen-depleted sea, or a rock falling from space. It will be the result of choices made by industries, by governments, by the billions of individual human beings who share this planet with the only animal that has outlasted everything else the planet has thrown at life. 450 million years of survival? The question of whether that lineage continues is, for the first time in its entire history, entirely up to us.